Welcome back here on Live Now from Fox, and you are taking a live look once again. This is over outside the Fulton County Courthouse in Atlanta, Georgia, as we did cover this breaking news over the past little bit here as the news started to come in that we got that ruling from a judge in Georgia, and it does sound like the ruling says that it's either going to be Willis or Wade. Essentially, Willis can stay on the case if Wade is off the case. I do want to bring in an expert here to help break all of this down for us. Mark Betterow is a criminal defense attorney. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Sure. Good morning. Happy to be here.
Of course. Well, first off, before we talk about the actual decision itself, can you break down for me the basis for this case and what led up to this point right here?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have a DA who apparently hired her unqualified boyfriend to supervise an incredibly complex criminal case, and in which she is in charge of having him paid an extraordinary sum of money. It turns out that they have a romantic relationship, and some of the defendants produced evidence that Wade was then using some money for him to provide gifts and vacations and whatnot for Willis, which certainly gives rise at a minimum, as the court found, an appearance of an impropriety of a conflict of interest. But apparently what the judge found was that it did not create an actual conflict of interest as required under Georgia law because the amounts were small. But certainly in any event, to say that this has been a disastrous week for the credibility of the Fulton County DA is certainly an understatement. They look terrible.
And I want to talk about the hearings itself, because we were playing them. We heard, of course, from Fani Willis herself. What stood out to you about the hearing, from Willis's testimony to the arguments on both sides?
Well, her testimony struck me, and I think many others who do this for a living, as beyond belief. Her demeanor was terrible. There was evidence that certainly contradicted what she said, and I think a reasonable person might find she even perjured herself as well as Wade. So, I mean, if this is the person who's in charge of prosecuting one of the most high-profile criminal cases in the country now and in the past several decades, you know, that's problematic. So factoring all of this in, factoring in the judge's decision, which did criticize her and even said there could be other issues that arise for her, such as ethical issues, professional discipline, whatnot. It's just, she looks awful in all of this. And we all know it's going to happen. Wade is going to get tossed overboard and Willis will stay on. But I mean, again, her credibility is so damaged. This is going to be political gold for Trump, certainly, although they may be disappointed in what the judge did.
So is it possible that she is still removed from the case after all is said and done?
I don't see her removing herself. I mean, at this point, it seems clear the judge has set a pathway for one of you has to go, and I think Wade will be the one to go. Obviously, she's the elected official. She's the one who brought the case. Ego and other reasons will allow her to say, I'm not the one to go. The other reality is many have said that Wade was never qualified from the beginning to be here. So it's in terms of what the judge decided, it's an easy decision. The problem is that Willis's credibility has been kneecapped. And the more she stays on the case, this is now part of the record. People are aware of it. And her credibility has been damaged. The credibility of her office has been damaged. This follows a few days after counts of the indictment were dismissed because they failed to present sufficient evidence, which is almost unheard of for prosecutors to, when they bring charges, to improperly produce the right amount of evidence before a grand jury. That's embarrassing. So, I mean, this whole thing the past week for her has been terrible.
Can you tell me a little bit about the judge in this case? We saw him quite a bit there as we were watching these hearings play out. What do we know about the judge overall?
Well, he's young. I think he's in his mid-30s and has been a judge for about a year. And certainly it's, I mean, look, I don't know how the cases are assigned to judges in the state of Georgia, but the reality is this is one of the most important and high-profile criminal cases. It's extraordinarily complex, and it has remarkably these issues like that have been decided that are certainly everybody's following, to be in the hands of someone that young is that's kind of rare. So, there may be criticism by some for that he might have been young to handle something like this. And I think some were critical, for example, during the testimony when you saw Willis trying to kind of take over from the witness stand, which of course should never happen. But he was put in a very difficult situation. But I mean, he certainly seems qualified, but certainly young. And the decision is going to be one of these decisions, again, splitting the baby, that will please nobody, as is often the case, and will probably subject him to criticism as well.
What impact would removing Willis have had on the Trump election interference case? We know at this point it appears unlikely that she's going to remove herself, instead removing Wade. But what sort of impact would that have had on this case in general if that had been how this has played out?
Well, the first thing that's important is that if Willis had been removed by the court, or if she ultimately decides to step aside, that does not result in the dismissal of the case or the indictment. And people need to realize that. What would happen is a new prosecutor would have to be assigned by some agency that exists in Georgia. And so that has two practical components to it. The first is there would be extraordinary delay, excuse me. Obviously, if the DA and her office are removed from the case, just the logistics of somebody else getting involved, getting up to speed, and understanding what they're reviewing would take several months at a minimum. The other, and perhaps even more serious issue that could arise is that a new person coming in and taking a fresh look may have a different view of the case. In fact, they could theoretically decide that there is no case. It doesn't merit prosecution. And that could ultimately result, if she were gone from the case, in the case ultimately collapsing entirely. But again, it seems clear that at least for now, she will stay on. She will be criticized. Her office will be criticized. And the case has less credibility today than it did yesterday, than it did last week. And they'll just continue onward. But, the Trump people should be pretty satisfied with this.
When we talk about this ruling specifically by the judge, does it have any sort of impact on any of the other cases against former President Trump? Is there any kind of correlation there?
No, not legally. I mean, legally, Trump's in, a hell of a mess. He has 4 trials in 4 different jurisdictions, and he needs to go 4 for 4 if he wants to come out of this unscathed. And one, in a legal sense, has nothing to do with the other. I think the relationship between these cases that could benefit him, again, is the credibility of the people bringing the case and the political component of it. So I think that clearly what's happening in Georgia helps him politically, and it helps him make his generalized argument that I'm being persecuted because I'm Trump and everyone is out to get me. And it certainly will strengthen those types of arguments that, he makes with respect to all of these criminal cases. But in terms of the evidence against him, whether it be in the federal cases or the other state case in New York, it won't have any impact in that sense.
Is there any correlation between some of those charges being dropped or dismissed, I should say, against Trump in the election interference case the same week as this decision is made? Is there any sort of correlation there?
No, I think they're two distinct issues that came up involving the same case, and it illustrates the credibility and the problems with the Georgia case. I mean, it's almost unheard of, as I said earlier, to have counts in a case like this for an investigation this long thrown out for a lack of evidence before the grand jury, and to have that followed immediately by a judge criticizing the district attorney and telling her it's you or your ex-boyfriend that you hired to supervise the case has to go. Again, it's disastrous. They're not directly related. I don't think one has legally anything to do with the other, or, in terms of having an impact on the case. But I think when you take a step back and look at the whole mosaic, it just shows you that the Georgia case is a mess.
Is this the outcome that you would have expected, just based on what we saw during those hearings and the information that's been provided? Did you think when this decision came down, it would be a you or him kind of deal?
No, I think, I mean, I understand what the judge is trying to do. Apparently, again, in Georgia, the requirement is an actual conflict of interest as opposed to other jurisdictions where it's the appearance. The appearance is clearly established. I mean, I don't think anybody could seriously doubt what happened here in terms of hiring the boyfriend and the money going back and forth and the allegations of being paid in cash to reimburse and all of that other nonsense. But what the judge held was that there's no actual conflict because the money in the grand scheme of things appeared to be trivial and didn't influence her judgment and, in terms of motivating her to bring the case or make it go slower or faster or kind of influence any of her decisions. So I guess in that sense, I'm not surprised in thinking this through that he saw that there was a problem. He didn't feel it arose to the level of an actual conflict, but he clearly was troubled by the evidence that was put before him, which again, this is no victory for the Fulton County DA. I wouldn't, if I were her and that office, I would not interpret this as a good thing. They look terrible. The judge said they look terrible. The public knows they look terrible. And, when you're bringing a case like this and you make these kind of just horrible errors in judgment, whether it be in presenting the evidence or hiring your ex-boyfriend who may or may not be qualified, if these are the people that are in charge of bringing the case against Trump, it's just going to embolden people who support Trump to say this is another example of just unqualified people with the wrong motivation to bring charges against me. And I assume he'll raise a lot of money off this.
I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but does this slow the case down at all as it is progressing through the system when you have this hearing situation underway and now you have to decide, is Willis going to keep herself on there? Is she going to fire Wade? Does that slow this all down or does it just kind of keep on going from here?
I think it will slow it down, but to be clear, it will not slow it down as much as it would have if the entire Fulton County DA's office was thrown overboard. But the reality is if Wade is the point person in charge of the prosecution and he's out, that's going to cause some degree of delay. They have to find someone else to take over. And, there's problems with that internally. But again, if he's out and just number two steps in and takes over, then, perhaps the delay will be marginal and it won't be as long as it would be if the DA was removed. You'd be talking months and months. I don't think that will be the case if Willis stays on. The question is, at some point, will the pressure be too much for her to stay on? Will there be ethical allegations made against her, professional disciplines sought? Will other elected officials in Georgia get involved? Will the governor get involved? Those kinds of things could possibly delay this. But either way, it's a mess.
All right, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us and break all this down for us. Is there anything else you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
No, I just, it's interesting that the decision came out the way it is. I don't think many people expected kind of an either or. And as I said, I imagine all of the political pundits will be extremely disappointed. And the only thing that both sides will agree on is that they're going to be angry at the judge.
I was going to say I read it over just a few times to make sure that I was fully understanding it. Mark, thank you so much for being here with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And you are taking a live look here outside the Fulton County Courthouse as we are following this breaking news out of Atlanta, Georgia. We do know right now it's either going to be Willis or Wade. The judge making that decision, saying that if Willis wants to remain on the Trump case, she does have to fire Wade. So she either has to get rid of herself or Wade.